Hey guys, this is a bit of an info video on the dynamic effort method and why we should be using bands and how to set up the bands for your deadlifts, your pressing and your squats. So firstly, why are we doing this? Well, we base a lot of our powerlifting work off the conjugate method. And basically in the conjugate method, you've got three different classes or phases of training. You have dynamic effort, looking to build speed. You have max effort, which is more slow lift strength. Then you have accessory work. So what we're talking about here is what would be part A in your powerlifting sessions, which is the dynamic effort work. And here we're looking to build speed, because if you can move fast, you can generate more power. Power is force times distance multiplied by time. So because of that time element, what it's telling us is that the faster you move, the more power you're able to generate, which is a good thing, because power is what we're chasing. So what we do is a small number of reps at a small load but moving very quickly. And traditionally what we do is 2 reps every 30 seconds for 5 minutes, giving you 10 rounds in total there. So that's why we want to move fast, to increase power. But why do we use the bands? So we use the bands because there's a variable resistance, an accommodating resistance. As you start a rep, let's say we're doing a strict press with bands, at the beginning of the rep, it's not as heavy, and then as we go, it increases the load. So what it actually does is increases the load at the range where we are not normally loading up. Normally, if you're doing a strict press, once you get it past your head, it becomes easy to do. That lockout becomes easy. Because it becomes easy, you don't get as much benefit from it. So by lifting not only fast, but increasing the resistance, the further it gets overhead, you're able to strengthen throughout the entire range. And this is the same reason that we do jumping versions of things like a jumping high bar back squat. You work that range explosively at the top of the squat in a range you would normally neglect. So how do we calculate this? How do we calculate what bands to do? Well, if you go too heavy and you move too slow, you don't get the power benefits, because remember, part of that power equation is time. So if you go too heavy, you don't get that. If you go too light, then you're not developing any strength at all. So that sweet spot, that Goldilocks zone, somewhere in the middle, it's about 65% of your max. So what we do is we do 40% of your max plus 25% band resistance. So that means that if you have a setup, again, for a strict press, if you were just using a bar, it's gonna weigh 65% of your max throughout the entire range. If you're using bands, at the bottom here, it's gonna weigh maybe 40% of your max, but as we go towards the top, it's 65% of the max. And that's the variable or accommodating resistance. So we calculate that basically by calculating what effect a certain width of band will have in those positions, be it overhead, in a back squat position, in a bench press position, or at the top of a deadlift. We calculate how much load is added by different widths of bands, and that allows us to calculate which bands we should be doing for different levels of strength. So let's go through and look at how to actually set up for 4 different movements here. Firstly, you can see we've got the setup for a deadlift. Now we use these pins that you can see on the corners. It's a really good way to make sure that it's set up nice and low, easy to set up this way. So you set up the bar with 40% of your max and then put whichever band thickness on is applicable for you. That's the best way to do deadlifts. You can anchor the bands down in other methods. You can even loop the band from one end of the barbell to the other and then stand on the band so you have your own resistance. You can use smaller bands, which you wrap around the bar, stand on again to add resistance that way. This is my recommendation. This is the best way to do it. Let's move now on to strict press. So I've got the setup here for the strict press, and what you can see is we have the bands set nice and low. Now this will vary depending on where you're doing this, but for our setup here, and if you're using this rig and this setup, for the strict press, we want these spotting arms to be 8 holes from the bottom, is where they'll be inserted into the upright there. So 8 holes from the bottom, and then you can see the band is around the thick part of the spotting arm there. So just to give you a bit of context on this, it's basically, for me, about 1/3 of the way up my shin is where the band itself is going to be set. So that is for your strict press. We'll move on now to the setup for a squat. Now, we do two types of squats for our dynamic effort work. We do a jumping high bar back squat and also a box squat, which is low bar. We use the same banded setup for both of these. You can see here, we've got to set up as low as possible. So in this rig, again, if you're using this rig here, we've got to set up 5 holes from the bottom, which is as low as it can go, as low as these spotting arms can go. And you'll see that again, the band here is around the thicker part of the spotting arms. So again, it's as low as it can go, and that is at ankle height for me. So again, set it up as low as you can get here. That is the setup for both your jumping high bar back squats and your box squats. Final one here is the bench press. And with the bench press here, we have this set up on this rig 7 holes from the bottom. Now, the difference with this that we haven't seen in the other setups is that this time the band is doubled over. So it's wrapped twice around the spotting arm. I'll show you what that looks like. So you can see there it's wrapped around it twice because there's a shorter range of motion in a bench press. We need to get a little bit more resistance, otherwise it gets slack at the bottom and always too much resistance at the top. Again, as you can see here, it's around the narrow part of the spotting arms, and if you're not using this exact rig, this is just above mid-shin for me, the point where the bands are attached. All right, hope that helps, guys. Hope that gives you a bit of guidance on how to set this up, but also why to do this. If you're gonna be spending the time doing this dynamic effort work, which you absolutely should because it's great for increasing speed and power, you may as well do it right. And that little bit extra time setting up those bands is gonna make a really big difference. If you can do that, it's gonna make sure you can maximize what you're trying to get out of your training. All right, any questions, please let me know and enjoy getting stronger.